Okay, good afternoon. So this week's Parsha is Parshas Beshalach, and sort of like the big story in Parshas Beshalach is the crossing of the sea, the splitting of the sea and the crossing of the sea, and then Az Yasher. But there's also another big, sort of like a very important section in Parshas Beshalach, and that is the Parshas Haman, the section in the Torah where it talks about the man. And it's actually a very significant Torah portion that Rav Sadia Gaon says that if you are in a scenario where you do not know what Parsha it is that week. Now, I'm not exactly sure how this works out, but somehow you don't know what Parsha it is this week, but you still have access to like a Sefer Torah. And you're laning the Torah, and you don't know which Parsha it is, you would read the Parshas Haman. So if you're not sure, like sort of like the fill-in Parsha, if you're not sure, is this section on the Man. And it's interesting because the Man is something that really happened only at one point in time. Like, it's hard to see sort of like the significance and relevance of the Man because it literally only fell in the desert for the amount of time that the Jews were in the desert. That's it, right? And it's not like we're going to have Man again. It's not something that we like pray for to have Man necessarily. We could talk a bit more what Man represents, but so it's interesting that we would say that this is like the generic Parsha, if it seems to be something that is so fit into one specific point in time. Another interesting thing about the Parshas Haman is that within the Parshas Haman is actually where we get the first time in the Torah where any halacha of Shabbos is mentioned. So Shabbos is mentioned in the 6 days of creation because it says that God rested, but we don't learn just because it says that Hashem rested, we don't learn what we have to do on Shabbos at all. It doesn't say that people should rest on Shabbos in Bereshis because Bereshis is not really giving us mitzvahs yet, right? So we don't learn that that we need to rest on Shabbos. And the first mention of any Hilchas Shabbos is with Man, and specifically what is the law that is mentioned about Man. So there were two laws, really, that were connected to the Man. Hashem says, I'm going to give you the Man, this food that falls from heaven. It falls from heaven every single day, every single morning. You wake up and you go outside and you collect this food. You're in the middle of the barren desert and you don't know where you're getting your food from. And we have this miraculous food, and it's the perfect food for the human body. It's perfectly engineered to serve all your nutrients. No waste, right? It's just like an absolutely perfect food that you're going to have prepared for you. But in order to receive this food, there are two conditions. There are two things you need to do. The first thing is that you may only collect the portion that you need for that day. So no double portions. You can't save some for tomorrow. You can only collect exactly the portion that you need for today. However, there is one time when you do collect a double portion. When do you collect a double portion? On Friday, because on Shabbos, there will be no going out to collect the Man. So the second law is that we cannot collect Man on Shabbos. So the first one is only collect what you need for the day. The second one is that you may not collect Man on Shabbos. So we see that there's some sort of connection between the Man and Shabbos. And even based on what we said previously, that on Shabbos, if you don't know what Parsha it is, you would read the Parshas Haman. So there's this connection between Man and Shabbos. So we're going to explore a little bit more about the details of the Man in order to understand what the connection between the two is, and also to try to draw a relevant lesson from the Man, even though, like we said before, it was sort of just stuck in one period of time. So what you might automatically assume is the connection between the Man and Shabbos, if we think about it, is that both the Man and Shabbos don't require any work, right? The Man was a sort of what we might call like a free gift from Hashem. Now, in order to buy food, we were just talking before the class started about trying to get our hands on some eggs, and how it requires some effort, and you have to go from one store to another store, and even before that, needing to make the money in order to buy the food, right? So that's the work that's involved there. Or if we go back in time to when we were maybe a bit more of like an agricultural society, and things weren't delivered in such a ready-made way. In order to have food, you had to plant the seeds, and then you had to, go through the whole process of plowing and sowing and praying that it's going to actually grow, and then the food grows, and you have to harvest the food, and then you have the grain, and then you have the grain, and you have to put it through the mill to turn it into flour, and then from the flour you have to bake, you have to actually cook with it. So there's so many processes and so much effort that goes into feeding us. But when it comes to the Mann, it comes to your doorstep, right? And again, it didn't require going out you didn't have to like stick a coin in somewhere to determine that you're going to be having the Mann the next day. And similarly, when it comes to Shabbos, Shabbos is supposed to be a time of no work. So even though, yes, it requires work, it says about Shabbos that when Shabbos comes in, kol malachta yasuya, all your work should be done. Now, we know, obviously, and we've probably all been involved in the work that comes up to preparing for Shabbos, right? But once Shabbos comes in, it's a time of rest, and we're not supposed to work. And whatever's prepared is prepared, and whatever is not prepared, you can't work for anymore. That's it. This is a time of rest. This is a time of stopping to do. So we might think that that might be a parallel between the Mann and Shabbos. But in fact, this is something that not everyone realizes about the Mann, was that the Mann, there were 3 different categories of the Mann. There were 3 different types of people in the desert, and I'm not sure exactly what the demographics were, like how many people fit into one group and how many people fit into the other group, but there were 3 different categories of people in the desert, and they each received the Mann in a different way. So the Mann, being that it was sort of like it was miraculous, so it was sort of tailor-made to that person. In my mind, it's like kind of science fiction-y. Like you could imagine in the future where people just like, every person receives their meals, exactly what they need at their door kind of picture, and it's tailored to their DNA. So being that the Mann was also spiritual, it was tailored to the spiritual state of the person. So at tzaddik, I know we all have learned, perhaps, that the Mann was able to taste like anything. Because the question is asked, doesn't it get boring to eat the same thing day after day after day? So the Mann was able to taste like anything. So that was actually only true for tzaddikim. Tzaddikim received the Mann, as it says about the tzaddikim, that they received it as this bread, and it came right at their doorsteps. And and for them, it was able to taste like whatever they wanted it to taste like. It's interesting because you would think, a tzaddik doesn't really care so much about food, so who cares if it tastes like that, versus the rest of us probably care a bit more, but maybe we could explore that. I don't know, I haven't looked into that. It's just coming into my mind now. But then the next group was the Beinoni, which is just, and not like, in this sense, we're not talking like Tanya language, we're just talking about the average person. The average person received the Mann as cake, as ugais. Rashi says it was like this sweet dough kind of thing. That's what it tasted like. And it wasn't directly at their doorsteps. They actually had to go out and gather it. And then for Rishaim, which we learn about some of the Rishaim who are in the desert, we have Dasan and Aviram or the Erev Rav, they received it as sort of just like as a grain. And it says they had to actually the language used there is like that they had to grind it b'meducha in like a mortar and pestle. They had to actually grind down the grain into flour and cook with it. And they had to go all the way out into the fields to sort of gather it. So there actually was an element of work involved with the Mann. So it wasn't totally work-free. So we must have something else that we could connect Shabbos and some other way that we could connect Shabbos and the Mann. Just another interesting point about how Shabbos and the Mann are connected is that we also learn out a number of things from the Mann about Shabbos food. Specifically, we learn out that we have 2 loaves of bread, and that was because, like we mentioned earlier, that we collect a double portion on Friday. And also, when referring to the Mann, it's when talking about the Mann, Moshe teaches us about the Mann, he repeats, I forgot what the word is, but he repeats a word 3 times, and basically from there the sages derive that we also have 3 meals on Shabbos. So Mann and the Shabbos food is also connected, as we see. Okay, so let's try to break this down a little bit more. Let's talk about the Mann. So Mann, we're going to call it from here, we'll call it lechem min hashamayim, bread from the heaven. And that will be as opposed to lechem min haaretz, which is bread from the ground, which is what we sort of are eating right now. So lechem min hashamayim. So we had this scenario already set up before. Every single morning, you're in a vast desert. There's nothing really around. And you're a huge group of people, right? A nation of over 600,000 just men between the ages of 18 and 60. So there were probably over a million people. And you have your children with you and elderly and, people with all sorts of needs. And your pantry every night is empty. And not only is your pantry empty, there's no store that you can just go to get what you need. Or you could put it this way, the store shelves are also empty, right? Everything's sold out. And so you're going to bed at night, and that's the state that you are in. You're going to bed at night with this completely empty pantry, this completely sold out store. And you're in a desert, and you're lots of people. Just like imagine that state of mind that you have to be in, especially in the beginning, right? Obviously, as the years passed and when things happen reliably, our anxiety is calmed down, right? As human beings, we learn to chill when things are expected. But in the beginning of this process, that is an extremely and scary and vulnerable place to be, to not know where you're going to get your basic sustenance from tomorrow. And that needs to be a miraculous delivery of food from heaven. And you're not allowed to take any more than you need for that one day. All you can take is for that one day. And we understand why God made that rule, because what would be the natural thing for a human being to do in this scenario is to go out and hoard as much of the Mann as possible. That's what we do, right? When we're scared and we don't know where our next meal is going to come from, the natural thing to do would be to go out and take as much as you can for yourself so that you have it for the next day, because we need to be prepared. There's a famous saying in the Gemara that there's a difference between someone who has pas besale, who has food in his pocket, versus someone who doesn't have food in his pocket. There's just a difference in our frame of mind when we know that we are safe and secure with our needs. And I think pas besale and this mashal of Mann is representing more than just the Mann. It's representing our basic human needs for survival. And so the level of bitachon that was needed from the Jewish people at this point in time is an extremely, extremely high level of trust in Hashem. In order not to be worried, you had to have this immense level of trust in Hashem. It's like what we might think is the highest level of bitachon. That I don't have food, and I'm going to rely that Hashem is going to make the food fall tomorrow. And I'm completely and totally okay with that, and I'm able to surrender to that. And we would think that that is really the highest level of bitachon that there is. Let's oppose that with lechem min haaretz. For lechem min haaretz, bread from the ground, and in general, when we're talking about bread and Mann, we're talking, I would say, in general, about the concept of parnasa, of sustenance. Right? For us today, money sort of equals sustenance and security. So for us, when we're receiving lechem min haaretz, when we're receiving bread from the ground, in order for us to receive, we know that who is the source of parnasa, who is the source of all blessing? The source of all blessing is from Hashem. Everything comes from Hashem, right? And I think anyone who's in this room will say that Hashem is the one who is the source of all of our blessings. However, being that the way that God created it when we're not in the desert, is that we now have lechem min haaretz. The nature of lechem min haaretz is that it requires a keli in order for us to be able to receive it. So as opposed to the man, which did not require any keli, it came directly from heaven, and it was obviously from Hashem, right? So you had this bitachon, but also you saw how the man came to you directly from Hashem. It was so obvious. When it comes to our food and our sustenance, we know, like we said before, you have to go to work, you have to have a job, you have to go to the store, you have to have the money to pay for it, and once you buy it, you have to come home, you have to prepare it, you have to cook it, right? There's all these steps that are necessary, and being that we are taking all these steps, the natural, as opposed to what we spoke about, the psychological state that the Jews were in the desert, where it's like naturally they're almost, your choice is either despair or trust, right? That's your choice in the desert. Either you're saying your despair, that's it, I have no food, I'm done, or trust, Hashem is going to make the food fall tomorrow. For us, we're not in that state. We feel a sense of security in ourselves, which is natural. It's natural to feel a sense of security in yourself because we feel like we are controlling the process. So because we need to make the keli, so we're making the keli, and God is sort of filling the keli truly. Where is that? If Hashem decided, you see many scenarios where two people invest in the same sorts of businesses, and one is successful and one loses all his money, right? So you would say, oh, they both made a keli. Yes, they both made the same vessel, and God decided that this one was going to have it and this one wasn't, right? But so really, it's coming from Hashem, and it says, right, on Rosh Hashanah, Hashem decides what everyone's going to have for the year. You can always change that through prayer all the time, where there's always that power to change the decree on Rosh Hashanah, but that is the way that it works, is that Hashem gives us this, the food or not. But again, there's this illusion of control. And there's this illusion of self-sustenance, basically. So that's the difference between the man versus us when we get food from the earth. And so the purpose of the man was actually to allow the Jewish people to experience this feeling of complete trust in Hashem. It's sort of programmed into the Jewish soul. It's the language that is used, is that it gave a nesinas kayach, which means like ability, but it's more than that. It's like this, you know how sometimes it's almost like a memory inside of us, right? Because we're all collectively part of one Jewish soul, we all had this experience of receiving the man. And so we have a memory inside of us of complete and total trust in Hashem. And even now, as we are reliant on making a keli and we need to do the work, it's still we have the power within us to tap into that bitachon. It's been programmed into us, that bitachon, that feeling of total reliance. And the Jewish people after the desert, where were they going to go? They were going to go into Eretz Yisrael. And once they enter into Eretz Yisrael, they're going to become farmers, most of them. They're going to work the land, and they're going to be getting their bread from the ground. And so Hashem was programming them and preparing them that even once you come into Eretz Yisrael and you are receiving the bread from the ground, that's not the true source of your food. You know where food really comes from. You remember that feeling of going to bed at night with that empty pantry and with the empty grocery store and the barren desert all around you. And then the food fell from heaven every day. And you see that I'm the one who gives you the food. So even when you are working for the food, you still are able to tap into that memory. And when we think about it, like I said before, we would think, oh, being in the desert, that's the highest level of bitachon. But it's not. Because that's sort of like the concept of there's no atheist in a foxhole, right? Like when we're pushed up against the wall, it's easier to access that space of trusting in Hashem. When there's no other option, right? Like when the doctor says, there's nothing more I can do, what else do you have to turn to other than bitachon? But when there are options, and and we feel like we have choices, and we feel like we're receiving from another place, then it becomes a lot harder to recognize that everything really comes from Hashem. That's where the true avodah of bitachon begins, because I'm not being forced into trust. I have to choose to trust. I have to choose to trust, and I still have to do the work to make the keli, but I'm also choosing to trust. And what you see is that when you do choose to trust, the way you relate to the work is also going to change. So what's sort of like the practical proof to yourself, oh, I've made the choice to trust in God, is that when it comes down to it, if you start to see, let's say, that the work that you need to do in order to get the food is starting to get in the way of certain parts of your spiritual life. And there's like a question, oh, should I put in these extra hours? Or should I, for a man, let's say go to minyan, for a woman, make time for a Torah class, make time to daven, things like that, right? Like, if it comes down to that choice, it's like either I'm going to work more to make more money, or I have the potential to invest in my spiritual life. That's sort of like a litmus test of where do I believe my sustenance really comes from? If I believe my sustenance really comes from Hashem, then where do I invest my time and effort? In my relationship with Hashem. And then I make the keli on the side, and I trust that God is going to give me exactly what I need, and that he decided exactly how much I'm going to have already anyway. Versus if I don't really trust and I do think I'm self-sufficient, then I'm going to make the choice to put in those extra hours or whatever it is, right? So it's in this scenario where the trust is really much more difficult to access, but I do have the ability to access it because, like we said before, we all receive that Mann. And we read the Parsha of the Mann every year to strengthen within myself this feeling of vulnerability to Hashem. And it's like an interesting meditation to think about, to like imagine yourself in the desert with nothing there, and there's no food available, and I need to just trust that it's going to come to my door. And I can approach that from a place of anxiety, or I can approach that from a place of like peace and acceptance and openness. And so it's interesting actually also that we mentioned before that do you need the car to be moved? Okay. I have to move my car. Or deal with the fire department, apparently. 1 second.